Fresh batch of lumber. Let's make some cutting boards. I think we have 12.
We do indeed have 12 boards this batch, and this batch is one of 2 for the holiday crunch. I was able to squeeze in one more batch before Christmas. Since this footage is from several weeks ago, I can say that future me pulled it off. We got this batch and one more out the door before the Christmas deadline. This year I really tried to stay ahead of the game, because once you're running right up to the wire, it stops being fun pretty quick. Especially when you have to tell customers their order won't arrive until after Christmas. But not this year. And the key to keeping all this moving is staying organized, whether that's me keeping the shop in line or just managing order details and shipping to make sure everything ends up where it's supposed to go. But even with the solid plan on paper, the wood still has the final say. Once I start breaking down lumber, you're reminded pretty quick that this stuff comes from trees, and trees don't grow perfectly straight. There are defects, color variation, and boards that are just harder to keep perfectly flat. And how you deal with that makes a big difference later on. For this board, I need a finished blank of about 50 inches long. If I went through the flattening process with it as one piece, I'd have to take off way more material than I'd want to. So instead of wasting all that thickness, I'll cut the board in half first, which immediately cuts the bow of the board in half as well. So instead of one 50-inch blank, I'll have 2 25-inch blanks. That'll make up one cutting board. And then I'll process everything like I normally would, getting everything flat and square so it can be glued into its desired blank. After that, I'll mix the pieces back up a bit to make sure there's a clean flow between wood grain and color variation. And this is the part I really enjoy. Once everything's laid out, it's just repetition. And I'm very much a cut and paste kind of guy. I'd rather sell more of the same design than focus heavily on customs. I'll absolutely make custom boards, but I just prefer doing the same thing over and over. It's easier for me, and it's just a lot more streamlined. Most of what I sell are my pre-made designs, and that's very different from someone like Nick over at Brownwood. He's the true inlay king. He focuses mostly on custom boards and is able to charge a much higher premium because of it. He makes fewer boards at a higher price, and I make more boards at a slightly lower price. Custom boards come with a lot of upfront work, figuring out what the customer wants, dialing in the design they love, and then drawing everything and make it inlay friendly. On top of that, most of his boards are much more complex than mine, with longer machine times and often multiple colored inlays. Where I'm fortunate is being able to sell the same designs over and over. I'll prep the artwork once, maybe make a few tweaks over time, but for the most part, it's a rinse and repeat process. The variables usually come down to things like wood type, juice groove, handholds, and stuff like that. That copy and paste approach just fits my style and my vibe a lot better. And at this point, I'm really just working out the list and making cutting board blanks. For the most part, I stick to 4 standard sizes, so this process is pretty much identical until the board gets an inlay. In this batch, I actually cut one board at 17 by 13 instead of 20 by 16, but because everything's rinse and repeat, it's not a big deal. I'll just use that board in the next batch. This makes everything pretty predictable, and that's just the way I like it. Which is why I'm hesitant to swap out tools that have already been doing their job. A while back, High Country Tools offered to send me a surfacing bit to try out. And I initially turned it down. It wasn't because I didn't trust the quality, I just don't like taking products from small makers unless I generally think I'll use them. He insisted it would cut faster and as clean as the 1/2-inch 3-flute upcut I normally use. I've tried a few surfacing bits in the past, and most of them caused more tear out than they were worth for the time saved. In this case though, I ended up giving it a shot and it actually did cut clean, and at more than twice the speed of the bit I was using in the past, mostly due to its larger cutting surface. It actually threw me off a little at first. I'm usually loading one machine to surface a board, then heading over to start the other CNC on its next board. With this bit moving so much faster, my timing changed and got thrown off. By the time I finished cutting a board to size, it was already time to swap boards back on the first machine, which left the second machine sitting idle most of the time. And honestly, that's not a bad thing. In the little bit of downtime I did have, I was prepping plugs for inlays, and those are pretty copy-paste as well. For the most part, I'll glue up one larger blank and cut pieces from it until I get the size I need. In this case, I actually had enough offcuts to generate plugs for several boards. What you see here is about 3 to 4 plugs worth of material depending on the size of inlay I'm doing. The glue up process is the exact same as a full board, but instead of ending up over 2 inches thick, these end up closer to 5/8 of an inch. And now it's time to finally calibrate the Redline Onefinity. I've had this machine for about a month or so, but it's mostly been handling non-inlay work. I just haven't had time to properly dial this one in for inlay work yet, but today is the day. If you're interested in learning how to do it yourself, we do offer a beginner CNC course where I walk you through the exact process step by step and give you tips along the way from start to finish. The course uses our cross knife cutting board as an example, which you will see me make 2 of them shortly. And it includes the knife file along with a full walkthrough of getting a proper fit and setting up your CNC files. I'll add a link to that down in the description if you'd like more information. Now let's get started cutting some inlays for some cutting boards. Once the inlays are cutting, the pace of the day kinda locks in and everything settles into a rhythm. And that's the part I really enjoy. Making content takes a ton of brain power and effort. You've got to really be on your game, always thinking creatively, and that can get pretty exhausting after a while. And that's where the copy and paste style work is perfect for me. It gives me balance. I get to express my creativity through video and content, and then I can almost relax and reset mentally by making cutting boards. It's still creative work, but it's more focused and honed. With making cutting boards, I can show up to the shop knowing exactly what needs to happen that day, whether that's breaking down boards for kits, firing up the CNC machines, or working on designs while the machines are running. For me, that combination just works really well. Outside of the holiday rush, the year usually looks like a cycle. I'll spend a few weeks focused on cutting boards, hand that batch off to Jess to be shipped, and then spend a few weeks focused on content. Once November hits, it shifts more towards production, and the content becomes whatever I can squeeze in, like this video. I can usually make a batch of about 12 boards in roughly 2 weeks. And when we were heavily focused only on product sales and primarily selling on Etsy, that's when I always felt the closest to burnout. All I could think about was inventory, the next batch, shipping times, customer emails, and just a constant racing clock in my head. I still feel that crunch sometimes, but switching back and forth lets me reset mentally before moving on to the next thing. It's also a lot less stressful managing a batch of 10 to 12 cutting boards than juggling 3 large clocks, 17 noodle boards, 3 cutting boards, and 7 dog feeders all at once. And this is all just personal preference. It's really something you have to go to and figure out for yourself. Some people thrive in those high pressure situations. I once did, but you evolve and things change. I see a lot of really skilled makers pop up on Instagram, build a following, grow a business, then after some time, they realize it's just not for them, and that's totally okay. It's also okay for woodworking to stay a hobby. Things really shift when you start adding deadlines and trying to pay bills with your work. That's why when I get asked for tips on going full time, it's such a hard question to answer. Everyone's situation is completely different. We've been self-employed for almost 10 years now, and I wouldn't change a thing. Business is a marathon, not a sprint. Just when you think you got it figured out, something's gonna humble you pretty quick. It's really a game of adapting and staying alive. So getting back to the cutting boards themselves. Every time I cut one of these off, someone gets mad. But why do I throw them away? Because end grain in this thin form just isn't that strong. And because it's end grain, I can't really use it as a veneer, so in the scrap bin it goes. The following day, this board gets surfaced and then I'll prep it for sanding. And the boards that don't fit on the bandsaw get zipped off with the CNC because that squeeze out glue gets trapped underneath the plug and I want that to dry as fast as possible so I can get the board flat again. Typically, if this was getting another larger inlay, I would wait for the board to flatten again before I press the next plug, but since this is so small, it doesn't really matter much. And since it's so small, it's not worth putting back on the CNC to remove it. And once I confirm the board returns to its flattened state, I'll put that back on the CNC to do the final surfacing before sending it through the drum sander. And on to the next group of boards, 4 sphere boards. Always making sure everything is flat so we don't end up with some weird fitment issues. These boards take roughly an hour or so per side. The 13-inch boards I press in one chunk, and then the 15-inch boards I press in 2 pieces, mainly because I don't want to race the glue and there's a ton of tiny little holes I need to work it into. I'll let those rest and surface those the following day. And on to the big boy. This one's by far the biggest sphere board I've made, coming in at a whopping 18 inches. In this monster I had to press in 2 chunks just because, again, it's a lot. And because it's such a large plug, you can see here that the warp is a lot more prevalent on this one. So I gave this one another day or so before I pressed the other half of the plug. And the boards just stage over here until they're ready to move on to the next process. And it always stresses me out when the customer orders the juice groove on the back because I gotta make sure that thing is perfectly lined up. And this board here is when the week started going downhill. I thought I successfully tuned the machine, but I was wrong. I successfully cut 2 of the cross knife inlays, so I was pretty confident at this point. This machine is still fairly new, and this was the first batch of inlays I've done with it. I've been using it for a bit now, but again, mostly flattening and other CNC tasks. But eventually I had to rip the band-aid off and get it dialed in for inlay work. When I went to test fit the plug, I couldn't even get it to seat in the board. And I knew I had a good fitment with my plugs, so it had to be one thing. The machine was not square. I thought it did a good enough job, but obviously not, and when you're doing inlays that need to fit perfectly, it does not take much to throw off your inlay. And the larger the inlay, the more prominent the out of squareness is going to be. The knives were small, so it really didn't affect those much, so I just cut this one apart and went for it. There wasn't losing much at this point, so I was like, I might as well just see if I can press it and kind of make it work. After pressing the letters, I gave it a quick surfacing and sanding just to kind of see what it would look like, and honestly, to my surprise, it looked pretty dang good. But we won't actually know until it's essentially finished. And here you can see it being out of square. I actually rotated this piece, and I kind of got to pull it into place to get it to seat down in there. Luckily, wood's semi-flexible, and this is exactly why I use a tapered bit for the tapered inlay, and it just makes everything a little bit more forgiving. And luckily this was a pretty simple design, so I was essentially able to kind of force it together. Normally I would have pressed this in one solid piece, but since it was kind of wonky, I did it in 2 just to be safe. And another mistake. On this one, I made a coating error, and luckily I caught it relatively soon into the carve. I'll end up just surfacing off the error and start fresh, and good as new. Which is why I make my boards relatively thick, give me a little bit more room for error, because in the end you're really not going to tell, it's just going to be a little bit thinner than my stock board. And if I end up having to take off more than I'd like, I'll just use that board for a future practice board with a new design or something like that, so it's never a total waste. And speaking of cutting boards, I also get asked pretty often if I make all my own boards, as in, do I buy pre-made blanks and just inlay them? I make all my boards from start to finish, as you can see. Part of it's pride, but more than anything, it comes down to quality control. It's not that I don't think other people can make a great end grain board, plenty can. And honestly, buying a blank can be a great option for someone who's just getting started or doesn't have all the tools yet. Anyone who's made an end grain cutting board knows how much work goes into it. Even before you attempt to add an inlay and risk failing and messing up $80 in wood and hours of wasted time. For me though, if someone's making really high quality blanks, the question becomes, why are they mass selling blanks instead of finished boards? You're 90% of the way there. And for that to make sense on my end, those blanks would need to be pretty cheap. And cheap and good don't usually go hand in hand, so I'd rather keep full control over quality by making everything myself. And sure, I could probably crank out more boards by outsourcing the blanks, but I actually enjoy the process of taking a pile of lumber and turning it into a finished cutting board. If all I'm doing is loading and unloading parts from the CNC, I start to feel like more of an operator than a woodworker, and that's just not what I want this business to be. For me, the machine just enhances the work I already enjoy doing. Sometimes scaling up and making more isn't the answer. Doing it the way that feels right is. And speaking of feeling right, this is about the time where I notice if there's any issues with the board or not. When you spray the water on it, it water pops the board, but not only does it water pop it, it expands and contracts the wood. So if the inlay's not seated properly, you'll feel it raised up in the areas where it didn't make a good connection. And thankfully, this board is perfect. You could never tell there was an issue with it. It's also my favorite time in the process because you can really see all that hard work pay off and these boards come to life. This is just water, they're not getting oiled yet. Right now they're sanded to about 150, 180, and then I'll do finishing sanding to finish them up. And then after they get their water popping and they dry, I throw them in this little laser here and I etch our logo into the back, just the way we choose to do the maker mark. It's a lot cleaner than a brand and it literally takes like 2 minutes per board. And just like that, a perfect little marking on the back. And then after hours of sanding, I finally get to oil the boards. I oil each one individually, and then I let them sit overnight to absorb as much oil as possible. For oiling, I use walrus oil, cutting board oil. It's essentially just mineral oil with other types of waxes in it. In my experience, it just lasts a little longer than standard mineral oil. And then each batch I end up making a handful of cutting board stands. I cut 2 of these per crack, and they take, I think, 8 minutes to cut 2 of them, followed by a bunch of sanding, and then I oil them with either tongue oil or just the cutting board oil, along with oiling up the rest of the cutting boards that ended up in the back of the pack. And here's a closer look at the cutting board stand. I actually had to make a bigger cutting board stand for this large 18-inch board just because it was a little tippy on the small one. But just look how massive this thing is. Then after everything's oiled, I just add feet and give them a nice waxing. Gives them an extra sheen and layer of protection. And that's the end of the video. Hope you guys enjoyed listening to me ramble and watching me make these beautiful boards. We appreciate all you taking the time to watch. And on to the next batch of boards.